All right. Hello. Welcome to the Antigen Cyber Podcast. My name is Timothy D. Block, Director Advisory Services of Antigen. With me, as always, is Stephen Legg, the CEO of Antigen Security. Stephen, how are you?
Hey, Tim, doing well. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. Let's talk about cloud security. What is cloud security?
So cloud security, I think, is a really there are a lot of facets to it, but for the purpose of how we define cloud security, like relative to SaaS products, as an example, is a good way of thinking about this. Would be any SaaS or third party application that is providing some kind of business technology output, whether that's file storage or secure communication, chat, or some kind of customer interaction or portal system. Any of these types of applications are really the types of things we would focus on from a cloud security perspective for folks that are consuming those like SaaS like uh, platforms online, or with tooling that connects to online platforms. I think arguably cloud security could also include as a discipline, a whole conversation around how you're managing public versus private cloud infrastructure, how hybrid clouds are developed. There's a whole conversation we could have around API security and kind of everything that goes into, building those type of cloud applications or cloud environments. But really, for the purpose of today's discussion, let's focus on kind of those SaaS applications that most businesses have, at least in some part.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I've talked about API security this past year, and that's one of the things I have to really define is talk about development, not the APIs that you use for what you're talking about with the SaaS vendors, which seem to be all over the other place. Uh, and I don't know if this is your experience, but in my experience, it's been more a huge concern for GRC from like the compliance angle, right? Is making sure that permissions and other things are set up so that things like data leakage and other stuff is not going to get the company compromised, because a lot of times it's not even the company itself, right? It's these third parties that are hosting all the data.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I think there's really a worthwhile conversation to be had around what, from a compliance perspective, around APIs, data security and encryption, and cloud security in general, for all those reasons that you just listed. Um, Absolutely.
So what technology is involved when we're talking about cloud security and we're focused on SaaS vendors here?
So when we talk about SaaS vendors and the types of security functions that we would expect, or that we would recommend folks look for when they're choosing different platforms, really comes down to a few things. Um, what is the business purpose, or what outcome are we trying to solve from a given platform? Does that platform integrate with our identity and access management strategy? Are we able to, you know, implement things like device-based authentication and multi-factor authentication? Are we able to um, integrate and our monitoring systems with those SaaS products, or to what level is their security alerting or logging enabled? What is the recoverability of that environment? When you're looking at things like SharePoint or other online storage mediums for your business, what is the recoverability of that data? How is that data encrypted at rest? Is it securely uh, stored and transferred when it's shared with other third parties that you share that data with? Those are all questions that kind of come up as a part of discussing security relative to most SaaS applications. And really, when you look at insurance underwriting requirements, those are some of the questions that they're most concerned with, right? Because what they're thinking about is, okay, if a bad actor gets in and takes control of the SaaS app, or has control for a period of time, what can the impact or the risk to the business look like, and is that something that can be recovered from?
So are SaaS and cloud security, is that I guess that's something as far part of your cyber insurance policy?
It's often a question and a requirement that comes up, yes, because naturally, when they ask things like what kind of email hosting provider or email provider you're utilizing, and whether or not you have proper security features turned on within those platforms. As an extension of that, once we've established that we're talking about whether it's Google Suite, Office 365, or some other platform that's similar, what those other integrations and kind of points of risk look like. Are we storing data on it? Does the email system flat notify users or administrators when unencrypted data is sent in plain text, things like that.
So I guess how are organizations checking? Are they just kind of passing those questions on, or are they doing scans, or like what's the approach there?
So I think the challenge with cloud security is that it's for regular end users or maybe business users that are managing these things without outside help. Oftentimes, when they're answering those questionnaires, they're using language from kind of marketing resources and other stuff on those product websites. When really they should be looking at like there's those vendors SOC 2 Type 2 reports and other kind of compliance attestations that specifically address things like how they're encrypting the data in their platform, how they're securing it, how they secure access to it, and what expectations there are. If there were any, flaws or vulnerabilities observed during those periods that, users or folks that are considering purchasing need to be aware of. Those are the types of questions I would like to see people ask, but those are not commonly questions that get asked of those types of vendors.
Well, and it's more of a broad thing too, right? So if you're a healthcare organization, your health data is different than your HR data, right?
100%. Well, and the laws that govern it are different too. So it really comes down to understanding what the business use case is, what the risk is. So like if you're using a SaaS application or third party application that is going to store data, what type of data is it going to store? And do we need to be concerned about things like encryption or how that data is retired or how that system is retired ultimately if there was a change down the road? And really those are again all questions to kind of ask coming into evaluating one of those types of solutions rather than after the fact, because 9 times out of 10 when a vendor is not evaluated in those ways and those questions aren't known, unless they're a very large vendor that's proactively answered those questions for other customers frequently, it can
Mhm.
put businesses in a really tough spot, when they have any sort of privacy request they have to respond to, or anything involving data that they're storing in those systems.
Well, and so how is an organization? Because is it I've seen questionnaires, but are you seeing anything? And we don't necessarily need to call out any specific vendors, but what is the vendor space like for cloud security in this scenario?
So there's a lot of vendors that do different forms of detection and response services, like MDR and MXDR vendors. And a lot of those vendors include monitoring of systems like, in the Microsoft world example, Teams and SharePoint and the other kind of Microsoft technologies that are, OneDrive that are driving a lot of that behind the scenes. But generally speaking, there are some there are some vendors that provide kind of third party bolt-ons to systems like that for backups or segmentation reasons that might be compliance driven. Let's say your insurance wants you to maintain at least 4 or 6 weeks of backups and systems like that, and so sometimes that means understanding what that cloud provider is natively offering versus what you need to bolt on to achieve from some of those perspectives. So whether we're talking about how that data is encrypted, how that data is destroyed, how that data or how those systems are secured and are monitored. Those are among the things that kind of the questionnaires are asking from a cyber insurance perspective.
But there isn't like a tool that like GRC teams are using that would allow them to check some of these environments, or are they just not allowed to do? Is that what
Well, on the insurance on underwriting side, sometimes they get the ability, and some insurers do scans of different environments, right? Like they'll do scans of externally facing websites as an example, or domains that are owned by a given organization that's seeking insurance. But a lot of times they don't because it impacts the buying cycle of the insurance product itself. A lot of carriers do not require any kind of like internal scan. They rely on things like vulnerability attestation and reporting for those underwriting questions. And so in the cloud security space, it makes it challenging because some cloud application or SaaS applications aren't necessarily designed to be monitored by security tools, and some of them don't even have the type of logging and alerting that would be needed to make any kind of sense out of that using a monitoring system.
Gotcha. Okay. I want to go. I actually want to take a step back to the MDR next year. So you're saying the company that's looking at these SaaS or at these SaaS applications, or the vendor they're going to use, like they set up their own MDR XDR, or the company's expected to have that?
it, the company is expected to have some type of monitoring solution, and it's not always a hard requirement. It's very rarely a hard requirement, but on that questionnaire, inside of those areas, it will ask things like, how are logs from your SaaS or third-party applications maintained, and are they compatible with a SIM or other log aggregation platform that's out there and in use by the company.
Gotcha. Okay. So how has kind of cloud security evolved over the years? Like, what have you seen in your experience?
Well, in terms of SaaS applications, 10, 15, 20 years ago, no one was really talking about how they integrate with security technologies, especially on the authentication side, and identity and access management side. Whereas, kind of fast forward to now, the vast majority of applications have at least some support for minimally MFA, but ideally, integration with federated authentication schemes for use cases where that makes sense. But from a tooling perspective, you know, even 5 years ago, I think there were not as many point solutions that were specifically designed to address some of the security challenges in those cloud environments. Such as some of like the specialized backup and encryption and cyber compliance tooling and privacy compliance tooling that are out there that bolt onto those, like the SharePoints, OneDrives, Dropboxes, whatever of the world. And ultimately help solve some of the deficiencies in those platforms. Because the reality is, I think, just like many areas of software, uh, a great deal of emphasis is placed on the function, the outputs and outcomes of a piece of software in terms of the operational things that it does, but oftentimes security is more of an afterthought and not something that's necessarily included. So it is encouraging to see more security integrations and functionality in modern SaaS applications, but I think there's still probably a disconnect, especially on the kind of the monitoring side for some of those applications, and just really, I don't know if do you remember the some of the statements that the head of the National Defense Cyber Defense Committee had raised months ago. I think it was like during DEF CON or just after, around API security and how really software producers are being called on by key experts in government and other areas to really focus on security and cloud security as an outcome um, across the nation. Do you remember some of those comments that were made?
I don't honestly, but it sounds about right, and I think it's a good thing to talk about because everyone's talking about AI, and it's like we still have a lot of these other problems. APIs are still growing, and AI is actually going to encourage more growth for this kind of stuff because you can write and develop code a lot quicker. So it's definitely a huge concern in my eyes.
Yeah, no, I think it was the head of the NSA that said it. I'd have to go back and check the quote, but um, she talked about the glaring deficiency in these things as evidenced in everything from, like major SaaS breaches like Kaseya and SolarWinds and others,
Mhm. Yep.
and just the fact that security as a conversation really needs to take a step back from the point solution mindset and focus more on those foundational security operational life cycles like product security, API security, AI security, just to name a few. So like I agree with you. I think the advances, especially in generative AI, on the developers and what is now possible with some of those tools, will certainly expand the use cases for different ways of applying, slicing, dicing, and making data available. But my hope is that those vendors will take that call to action more seriously, and not just focus on those operational outcomes, but focus on how those cloud systems can be compliant with security methodologies, frameworks, and reporting requirements. Importantly, because when it comes down to it, if there's a major incident involving data that is stored or has passed through those systems, forensically speaking, that gives culpability kind of to everybody involved in that process, including the vendor, if those security practices are not well maintained. Like look at what LastPass did in the breaches that happened recently for them. There were basic security hygiene type practices and protocols that weren't applied to something that really, by all extensions, has no excuse to be allowed to operate that way, especially when you're a security vendor, a SaaS vendor that's supplying a critical piece of security functionality to users. So, these are the kinds of failures I think that we as an industry have to start to try to get ahead of. And I think the vulnerability community has done a lot to kind of advance the conversation, but there's just different pockets and dynamics to it, I think, that have been interesting and both limiting over time.
Well, and so how do you do that though? Because LastPass, for example, would be one that you send a questionnaire to, and they're going to go, everything's great, we're secure. They're going to check all the boxes on stuff. People go, okay, well, we're going to use this. So, I mean, like, how do you actually improve that kind of security?
In terms of a vendor review,
Yeah.
or vetting people,
Or
vetting
vetting
vendors
people,
before.
or like
Yeah.
like it's like I like the idea of pushing security forward on these things, but how are we actually able to do that? Like, what do we have to do as an industry to accomplish that?
Well, regulation is an unpopular topic pretty much across the board, so I won't really touch that. But some form of regulation is going to be important, and we've already started to see that kind of come through. Whether you're talking about some of the more recent SEC mandates or other
Mhm.
reporting requirements, privacy laws that have come to fruition in different states, that a majority of states are now adopting, and as well as nations around the world. Um, but I think, to your question, the way that you stay ahead of that as a consumer, or as a business that is using these platforms, is by doing vendor reviews in general. Like, have you even Googled to see if there are any eventful breaches involving that vendor in the last 36 months, or even beyond that? What was their response to those breaches? Did they take them seriously and show that they fully addressed the underlying issues, or was it half cocked, or not, not a response that was getting them across the finish line in terms of addressing whatever led to those the serious incident or breach that occurred. And I think that's kind of the start of it. And the other end of it is just putting putting vendors on point more directly with questions like, give me an example or a use case of where your product was failed or circumvented. Tell me about the times that your product didn't stop a given thing, or couldn't prevent this outcome, and how that impacted the customer. um, I guarantee you vendors will not be extremely excited about getting asked those questions, but those are really the types of things and the types of conversations we have to start having as an industry, because we really just can't. There's no other way to kind of enforce, or put pressure on vendors to do the right thing, other than that kind of like the awareness that's generated from open communication around incidents and reporting, which I think is the big reason that breach reporting is actually probably one of the healthiest things from an accountability perspective for all businesses relative to cyber risk.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I could see also if a company has like a bug bounty, or some sort of, I know they probably have to have an annual pen test report, but I've just in the work that I've done running a pen test team, and also working with GRC to check some of these companies, like some of these pen test reports are just awful. And then our team comes in and usually beats them up, and they're like, wait, you got where? It's like, yeah, and it was actually super easy. So I definitely think anybody that's in a bug bounty program, and that's to your point though too. You can see do they have a bug bounty program, and are they doing payouts and things like that. I think that's definitely something you can look for to see if they're doing some of those security practices. And to me, unfortunately, they're kind of advanced because a bug bounty program does cost money to do, but you have people looking for stuff on a pretty regular basis.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's essentially crowdsourcing some of your QA and security development, right?
Yep.
You're doing testing after the fact with bug bounty programs, and so you're using external testers in more of an ad hoc fashion to facilitate that over time. So yeah, there is certainly cost and complexity to that, but I agree with you. I think that is one among many possible points that could be a good indicator that a company does take their application security practice seriously.
Yep, yep. And I've been on the inside where it's like, I would love to go to a bug bounty program with this, but we are going to cost the company way too much money because they're going to find all this different stuff. So if the app's out there though, it usually means that they're willing to bet that they have a pretty good application in place for security. But one other note I wanted to get to, or item, before we call it here, because you mentioned it and you've kind of talked around it a little bit, and it's a bit ironic with identity access management and Okta having some pretty gnarly breaches recently that have gotten other companies in trouble, right? As they had the breach, and their whole thing is identity access management. But like, how do because I think cloud security, there's already identity access management issues and still are issues within the company, but now you're adding like other login portals, other systems essentially within the cloud space as far as like SaaS vendors go. So like, how is a company or even just an IAM team supposed to tackle that kind of problem?
Well, Okta is a complicated situation to unpack because they are an identity and access vendor, right? So they're the way that they tie into other SaaS applications and just customer environments is unique and kind of specific to them. I would say that again, in terms of preventing those types of things, there's some pieces you just can't predict. But to quote a line that's really big in the insurance industry, the past is very indicative of one of the most indicative things you can look at to determine what's going to happen in the future. And so while methods may change, attacks may change, software may change, criminals are going to be criminals and do criminal things. And so with vendors like Okta, I think the thing to their disadvantage was the previous compromise before these recent ones that included their source code and other kind of critical components that malicious actors could use to weaponize parts of their platform or circumvent pieces of the security that's offered by it. And clearly with this kind of secondary event has happened recently, um, at a minimum, not everything that was needed to be solved in that conversation could have been. So, for vendors like Okta, I think it's a tough look where they're at now versus kind of where they started. I think they did a great job marketing and kind of promoting themselves as a leader in the IAM space, but then on the flip side have those types of things happen that are related to basic cyber hygiene and just you know code and data management issues. I think that can be very challenging for a team that's dealing with that. And so that's why I strongly urge doing those reviews and including in the scope of those reviews any kind of publicly reported incidents or vulnerabilities or anything that has led to bad outcomes for customers in the past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So where do you see the future of cloud security?
Well, I think, like all things we've seen in technology over the last 5 to 10 years, the most effective versions of things are going to be solutions that are built incredibly close to where that activity is happening. We've seen this transition in kind of the MDR space with leaving the traditional data lake SIM model and getting detections and telemetry out closer to the EDR or whatever security tools you're using to collect that data. And so in the cloud security space, I expect kind of more of the same. Whereas 10 years ago we might not have been able to see solutions that could proactively go and scan for, data that's being stored in plain text that shouldn't be on cloud systems, and then encrypting those, or automatically moving them to a secure location, and backing up those systems. I think that we're going to see functions continue to get closer to the chest on those cloud systems and security outcomes that are being demanded by, some of the privacy and other regulations and laws that are out there.
Okay. Any final thoughts on cloud security in general, or something that we didn't go over?
I would say that, as a takeaway for anyone listening, if you're not sure if you have cloud security addressed, the questions to ask yourself are: am I storing any sensitive or critical data?
Well, that's awkward. I don't know if Steven dropped off or he's muted himself somehow. Lost internet. And then there was one. Well, with that, I think what Stephen was going to get to was, being aware of what and where your data is stored, and being very conscious of that. Obviously, prioritizing what you um, have as far as your sensitive data has kind of tiers. Your HR data is just as important though as your any of your other customer data, because it's all PII, PHI kind of stuff. But then there's also lesser known, publicly available data that you don't necessarily want breached, but could be breached. And then just being conscious of all the places that and services that are being used. I'll give an example from my experiences. There is software out there that you can download that will help you with your writing. Microsoft Word already has that built in. Now, again, keeping in mind, you turn that on, Microsoft is now getting anything that you've written in email and Word documents, but that's okay as well too, because I mean, if you're using Outlook, it's already up there. But adding in another third-party vendor that does that stuff might not be as ideal, because then you're sending stuff to this other organization. So, especially with AI as well too, where people are taking and using AI to really massage and gain insights into the data, being aware of where that's being sent is something that needs to be identified and accounted for, because that's one of the big things with AI is data leakage is a huge risk for a lot of that stuff, and that's kind of goes along with the cloud security space. So with that, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap. I do have a text from Steven. Looks like he wanted me to go ahead and wrap up. He lost internet, so that's fun. But send us any follow-up questions or thoughts. I will be at MySecCon if anyone's going to be there. That is next week, November 17th. So looking forward to anyone meeting there. Come up and say hi, and we will see you next time on the Antigen Cyber Podcast.